Hi, everyone. Welcome again to our third session of the day and third panel. I'm very happy to be here with the speakers, but I'm going to introduce you in a moment for our quality education panel. As we discussed before, and we just discussed in the breakout rooms as well on Zoom for the challengers, and quality education is definitely one of the keywords that came out of the first two panels and in all our discussions. So finally, this is your opportunity to ask any questions around this SDG, that is the goal number 4, and is all about quality education. So ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. This is UN definition of this goal, and why have we selected this? Why the Seedstars team and FT Talent team thought that this was such a meaningful topic to go through today, and also have challengers, startups, and individuals trying to tackling it, because achieving inclusive quality education is critical and is one of the most powerful tools for achieving sustainable development. Our panel discussion on quality education today will explore how innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship can support the availability of inclusive quality education for all. Just a few data here. Why is this such an important topic that we discussed today? Because an additional 101 million or 9% of children in grades 1 through 8 fell below minimum reading proficiencies levels in 2020. And also basic school infrastructure is lacking in many countries. We are lacking drinkable water, electricity, and hand washing facilities in many schools all over the world. Today, I'm here joined by 3 top experts to discuss with you what does it mean quality education. Let me introduce you guys, Mercedes Mateo Diaz, that is the Education Division Chief at Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. Mercedes has been coordinating the research, design, and execution of the Innovative Education Project. So it's really a pleasure to have her here today. Her work covers different areas of the international development and the social policy, with a strong emphasis on inequality. She has contributed to the areas of institutional reform, female labor force participation, early childhood, socio-emotional and digital skills, and social cohesion. Thank you so much, Mercedes, for being with us today.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank
Hi,
you.
Mercedes. And then we have here my colleague of the Financial Times, Andrew Jack. Hi, Andrew. Andrew is the global education editor at the Financial Times, overseeing its education coverage, including a recent magazine on schools in lower income countries, business education, including its rankings, and the Free Schools Access Program that Andrew is going to tell us a bit more about. He has been a journalist at the FT since 1990, including as a Paris correspondent, Moscow bureau chief, pharmaceuticals correspondent, and head of curation. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining the conversation. And then last but not least, it's a pleasure to have the principal of Imaginable Future, Teresa Mbagaya, working and focusing on quality education and driving investments and activities within Africa with a focus on quality education, and joining this panel. Prior to her current role, Teresa has been serving as Microsoft Education Lead in East and South Africa. As the head of Econet Education, Teresa drove the development of Zimbabwe's first digital education platform. 2020, Desmond Tutu Associate, and 2019 Obama Foundation Africa Leader, Teresa was previously named by Forbes as one of the 30 most promising young entrepreneurs in Africa, and has served as an advisory member of a global education platform under the UN Special Envoy for Global Education. So thank you very much to the 3 of you for joining us today and joining the Financial Times Seedstars team, but above all the watchers that are literally viewing this from all over the world. We are really covering all the continents and so many countries throughout this event. So it's a real pleasure to have you here, because I think you can really cover so many different perspectives and, of course, the point of views based on your experience. So the first question that we would like to ask you, and I will start with Mercedes and then we can go around, is basically, what do we mean by quality education? I gave a kind of very general UN definition, but what is your definition of quality education, and why it's so important that we're discussing this today?
Thank you, Virginia, and I thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for convening us on such important topic precisely today. And yes, for me, quality education means providing to every individual a chance to grow, to have a prosperous life. It's an education that gives you the tools to become the best possible version of yourself, both at work and in your personal life, personal, social, and community life. And it is an education that doesn't leave anyone behind. So there is a dimension of equality into that definition. It adapts and compensates for the differences in opportunities and resources that come with our family background. So that would be my definition of quality education.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. And Andrew, based on your point of view and your experience at the FT, and specifically, you are our global education editor and the point of reference. What does it mean, quality education?
Well, I'd agree with Mercedes. It's really about maximizing the opportunities for everybody, so their talents, their skills, their energy, their ideas. It's about being ultimately able to not only master the basics, but really how to develop personally, to be able to think for themselves, to learn, to broaden their horizons. And it's about applications from learning basic skills and knowledge through to interacting with others, working in teams, being impactful, trying to engage with the wider community. And of course, in my reporting, I see huge differences and challenges in different parts of the world. In many, particularly lower income countries, basic issues of personal safety, of food security, of support and infrastructure, including digitally, are really important. But even in richer countries, we have kind of huge divides and challenges, and that's why we can perhaps talk about it later. But also, beyond reporting, the FT tries to provide many of its resources for free in order to actually offer opportunities and insights and real world reporting that can hopefully enrich study and activities beyond school.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and definitely we are going to chat about that. And for you, Teresa, based on your amazing experience and really your overview from corporate perspective, but as well from a ground-based perspective, what does it mean, a quality education, when we talk about quality education?
Absolutely. I want to build on something that Mercedes had mentioned as well, which is the ability for all young people to thrive. When I think about quality education, it's specifically around this. It is not simply around foundational literacy and numeracy, which is an incredible groundwork for all young people, but how do we focus on the whole child? How do we focus on the social emotional learning components, the physical well-being, the mental well-being, so that all young people can thrive in this world? I want to tap into something that Andrew had highlighted, which is just the ability for young people to exist in a truly dynamic world. And we see that we live in an incredibly complex world, quite interdependent, and young people all the more are needed to be more resilient, more adaptive, and they need to be problem solvers to solve some of the biggest issues that we face today, including climate change and resilience. And so when I think about holistic education or quality education, for me, it's not simply what happens inside a classroom, but it's also around the mindsets that we build for young people also outside of the classroom.
Yes, thank you very much, Teresa. And I think when we are talking about quality education, what are the kind of goal outcomes that we can build upon and we can leverage on when we are thinking about what we should be working towards? Mercedes.
Yes, so I would like to start by connecting to what both Andrew and Teresa mentioned before. So first, I think an important idea before I go straight into the goal outcomes is that the school is kind of, we've seen that particularly during the pandemic, is a hub of services. It's a hub of services because it's more than the place where you go, where kids go to learn. It's a place where they get vaccination, they get their vaccines, they get food, they go and find safe spaces, motivating spaces, and they also learn not only as Teresa and both Andrew were mentioning, they acquire not just the cognitive skills, but also the 21st, what we call the 21st century skills. So these social emotional and as a context, I think the first decision we need to make when we talk about the goals of education is, are we educating workers or citizens? So do we have a more holistic, humanistic approach, or do we have a more utilitarian approach? And I think the answer probably lies in the middle. It's not neither one or the other, right? So we have to take into account that we are living in unprecedented times, accelerated changes in technology, migration, demographics, climate change, and now the COVID-19 pandemic. And all of these factors are reshaping the world we live in, the social, the economic, and the political order. So I truly believe that we shouldn't be educating second-class robots, but first-class citizens. That means individuals who, as Andrew said, who can learn along the life cycle, because we don't live anymore in a world with compartments, with clear stages. We learn, we work, and we retire. The world doesn't work like that. The world doesn't work like that anymore. Life is a continuum in which we have to learn in every moment. We also need to become green, global, civic, diverse citizens. So in that sense, we launched a couple of years ago a 21st, what we call 21st Century Skills Initiative, aimed at promoting skills for work and for life. And so we are the IDB, we have a role as a backbone organization. We bring together public and private sector stakeholders to strengthen the learning ecosystems and to equip citizens with those life skills. And we, for example, have been promoting Rise Up, a climate change education initiative that seeks to encourage children and youth to use their creativity to come up with feasible, sustainable strategies to mitigate climate change. And it also provides schools with a green school kit, lessons plans, and give you video games. These are the kind of resources targeted at teachers and students that are transforming our education systems. And the other important thing, going back to the more utilitarian type of arguments, is that we at the same time need to provide students with the skills they need for the jobs and careers of the future. Real educational opportunities have to come hand in hand with economic opportunities. Students don't learn the cognitive and 21st century skills in Latin America and the Caribbean, the region I work in. Students don't learn the cognitive and the 21st century skills they need. And so that situation has further deteriorated during the pandemic. So jobs, we live in a world.
I think we have a problem with Mercedes connection now. Okay, sorry, Mercedes.
Are we good?
Can you repeat what you just said in the last sentence, because your connection is breaking a bit?
Oh, I'm sorry. So no, what I was saying is that we must provide students with the skills they need for the jobs and careers of the future. So now I'm talking more not just to the humanistic approach of what schools should be and what kind of outcomes we should focus, but also on the more utilitarian side, in which real educational opportunities need to come hand in hand with economic opportunities for our children and youth. And so that's basically the situation, and that's what companies.
Okay, I'm gonna interrupt for a second Mercedes connection. And I think I'm just gonna leverage a bit on this point on what Mercedes was discussing, Andrew. And maybe, just to reframe it a bit in an old way, humanistic way, let's say, Plutarch used to say that mind is not a vessel that needs filling, but wood that needs igniting. And I think this is a kind of a nice metaphor to make us understand how critical thinkers need to be equipped, but above all, like how it's so much better to have, rather than a full mind, a well-made mind. And I think there is quite a lot that with your work you are doing at the Financial Times to enable that. And maybe if you want to elaborate on the Mercedes point as well, on the kind of a different education we can give to people, and how we can be useful in this case, even journalism. You're on mute, Andrew. Yeah, you're
Sorry,
right.
can you hear? Yeah, I say I can't really improve on Plutarch. I think it's absolutely right that schools should not be about simply absorbing facts. It should be about learning skills. And those are both about learning themselves, but they're also about social interaction with others. I think if we're talking about outcomes overall, to agree with Mercedes, it starts in many countries with basic data around school attendance, and that must be, of course, for both girls and boys. That's still a huge challenge, about whether teachers are even present in the classroom, about issues around violence and hunger that are applying in many low-income countries. And then it's about learning and engagement, and that includes, of course, in richer as well as poorer countries, how far students, particularly in this current time, are being able to engage, even if they're having to learn, unfortunately, remote. And then to Mercedes' other point, absolutely, I suppose, if we're looking for the ultimate outcomes, it should be about self-fulfillment, but also what comes next. What we don't want is to see students leaving school dropping out early or failing to be able to progress, whether it's to higher or further education and continuing study, or to move into the world of work with some sense that they've got a set of skills and a network that they can continue to use and grow with over time. As to you asked about our own role in that, I mean, I do think, particularly in this era of social media and a vast explosion of fake news, there's a real need to both understand civilized engagement and discourse, but also to discriminate and try to identify high quality sources of credible information, data, facts, reporting, analysis, and balanced opinion. And that's certainly one area that we try to offer our free content to help students and teachers alike to be informed citizens and to draw on the most recent and global and analytical perspectives to really understand and engage and imply what they're learning and what they need to do in their studies, in essay preparations, in class discussions. And then as they think about future careers or job opportunities or additional study, and how to draw on those insights and demonstrate their analytical skills and their ability to synthesize and apply going forwards, that will be so relevant to the rest of their lives.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I think we are really working hard towards our education mission at the Financial Times as one of our core values of what is our vision for Financial Times, a newspaper, and generally something that we can share with the news industry. That is, a goal for us as what is our meaning in society, what is our role in society, and making this very clear. I think it's really important for even assuring our own survival as newspapers, as you were mentioning. Teresa, what do you think about the goal outcomes? What we should be working towards?
One of the things I always go back to is, for instance, in the African continent, of young people between the ages of 15 and 24, only 60% have at basic a primary level education. Not only that, once young people actually are leaving our education systems, it's quite difficult to say whether or not they have learned what they needed. So what are the basic foundational competencies, learner competencies that are required? And so when I think about one fundamental goal outcome, it's simply that we have improved learner competencies and learner outcomes. And yet there are few foundational things that we're missing oftentimes. One is around teacher education and teacher quality. We know within school, by far, the biggest variable on student outcomes and student success is teacher quality. And yet we still struggle with ensuring adequate support for our educators, adequate training and continuous training for our educators to be able to provide that level of grounding for our young people. And so when I think about a goal outcome that is around improved learner competencies, the first thing that is required really is that we are building and sustaining the quality and level of educator components that we would require within our education systems. The other is around the importance of early years and early childhood education. And maybe Mercedes can speak to the Latin America example, but within a majority of African nations, early childhood sits within the Ministry of Health, or toggles between the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health. So even the commitment there from a government perspective is quite limited. Funding towards the sector is also quite limited. And so as we think about getting more and more children ready for first grade, ready for their first years into schooling, which has significant implications for later outcomes. I think it's incredibly important that we also invest in early childhood education. The last, which I'll tap into, and I'm so happy that both Andrew and Mercedes have continued to reiterate this point, is just how critical it is that we're building the right mindsets in young people. Mindsets that tell young people that they exist in a global context, that understands the complexity of what it means to exist in this world, and certainly what it means to contribute to a better world for ourselves, for our communities, and for other global citizens. And so this is one that I think, as we go across the conversation today, we'll keep coming back to. But for me, specific outcomes for improved quality is certainly learner competencies. It is investing in building on our teachers. It is prioritizing early childhood education. And it's really focusing on developing a young person who can contribute to the global context.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and thanks for bringing back everything that was discussed before. And because you called Mercedes for the LATAM examples, are there anything, any examples in terms of like most urgent things that of course, in the kind of geographical context that you act and worked for, you can see and basically you can suggest we need to address to? Just a reminder here in the audience, we have startup founders as much as many other individuals that are really trying to tackle the SDG goals from a bit more pragmatical perspective. So with their ideas, with their startup, with their entrepreneurial spirit, they are here listening to you, really trying to think how their innovation can address that issue. So I'll leave it to you, Mercedes, maybe with some insights from LATAM.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think one of the we are urged to overcome the current learning crisis. That's what we call it in the region, and I want to emphasize that what we are living today, so through the pandemic and the consequence of the pandemic, because as you know, the Latin American region was the Latin American countries were those that kept schools closed for the longest time. So we are now talking as we speak about more than 200 days of school closures on average in the region. So that has of course had important impacts on learning, on access, etc., on motivation of students. But I want to emphasize that the pandemic only accelerated a process that had already started. So the structural programs that were already present in our education system. So now we need to recover, not just to recover, but we need to rebuild our education systems better after the pandemic. We cannot go back to a new normality similar to what we have pre-pandemic. And so in that sense, and speaking to these entrepreneurs that are here today, in Latin America and the Caribbean, we need to, and very much along the lines of what Teresa was mentioning, we need to improve learning. By third grade, 48% of Black students have not mastered basic math concepts, and over 50% do not read and understand text as they should. This is more than double the OECD countries' average. So that's one thing. Learning, it's a huge need. The other one is access, and I completely agree again with Teresa about that the need to improve access for the early years. In the region, most of the countries have, for 4 and 5 years old, education is compulsory. So basically, and around that age, we have an 80% coverage rate. So it's pretty decent compared to, for example, our OECD countries' average is about 90%. So we are pretty good on that. Now we need to work on the 0 to 3 to age range, which also, as we know, so access and coverage along these ages from 0 to 3 also will have not just an impact on kids' development, but also on their mother labor opportunities, which is another related outcome. And so that would be the second thing, access. The other important moment in life is not just the early years in terms of access, but also secondary education. So the teenage and youth moment in life. And in there, about 1 out of 2 students do not finish in the region secondary education. Andrew mentioned mentioned and spoke to that before. And so this is, and even those who graduate from secondary education, only 19% only have the minimum basic skills needed to succeed in life. So that's the second big priority. Then third, I mentioned that before, equality. Education is not today in Latin America and the Caribbean, one of the most unequal regions in the world. Education is not a leveler of opportunities. When a poor kid looks at her or his parents, he probably sees his or her future. They don't think of education as the key or the passport to a better future. And it shouldn't be like that. The pandemic has brought inequalities into the spotlight, showing that for many students, digital learning, for example, is still not a possibility and will not be in the near future. And finally, a fourth thing which I think is also important, and it's financing. Financing combined with innovation, because we need more resources, but we need to do more with the resources that we already have. So this is something that we as at the bank, we work on. We have a vision 2025, and we are supporting more investments in education in the region. We need to close the connectivity gap, the digital divide, and we believe that digital transformation is key to deliver better services and to adapt learning experiences to the needs of each student, to scale up interventions given current fiscal constraints, and to make sure that every student can keep connected, no matter the circumstances, no matter where they are, and to reach every child to decrease the inequalities in learning that we see in all the countries.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. I think you really went through so many key points that are so strategic for our thinking and to build our knowledge on this SDG goal. But Andrew, you before have been mentioning that, from your perspective, from your research and from your reporting, there is also another perspective that we can bring a bit on other markets that you're covering in terms of these, of course, are some key points for certain markets, but do we see such a big difference, maybe, even for Europe? Because just to sum it up with one sentence, the pandemic has wiped out 20 years of education gains. So did you see anything different in our continent, maybe in our region, or is another perspective, but we can see the same exact problems?
Look, I think there are some problems that are very regionally specific. I mean, clearly in Europe and North America, there was largely greater degree of digital access than in some of the lower income countries of the world. And that was fundamental during the pandemic. And then, of course, national policies, which varied very widely within Europe, let alone in parts of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and so on, meant that policymakers took different decisions on whether to send children home from school, for example, and the extent of the impact of the pandemic on their learning. So all of those things are quite varied and nuanced in all parts of the world and at all income levels. I think, there's no doubt, though, as Mercedes was saying, there's been this huge so-called learning loss. There was a recent estimate by the World Bank that it would be equivalent to something like $17 trillion of a loss in lifetime earnings for people who've been out of school and will never entirely catch up. And that's really got to be the top priority for policymakers everywhere, thinking about how to reintegrate children and also teachers, many of whom have been lost to the school system or feel burnt out or didn't have income to continue to learn and teach over the past few months. So those challenges are enormous, and they're, as I say, differential in their impact, but common in their trend. And then well-being as well, particularly mental health for many students who've been isolated or at home or in difficult circumstances and away from their friends. So there's got to be also a pretty common effort by schools around the world at the moment to bringing students and teachers back together, to thinking about ways that they can catch up. So kind of streamline often the curriculum to focus on the key things that matter. to emphasize more significantly mental health and support and teamwork as part of all that, and also to engage increasingly with their communities. So schools, sometimes were seen as a bit of a black box that students were sent to and then came home from. I think one thing about the pandemic is it's raised a lot of interesting questions about the community and parents and family engaging more with supporting learning, both within school and outside school. So I think that's going to be a really important area to build on as well.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And on this point about the community, Teresa, because of your experience and also your investors' experience, have you seen any ideas or groundbreaking innovation that is maybe leveraging on the kind of a local dimension of education, and maybe some innovations that, of course, can use a digital aspect, but as well never forget about the community power in terms of the education that people can gain. And we discussed that education is not linear for most of these people from certain communities. Do you have maybe some examples that you would like to share with us?
And I want to also, before I answer that, just tap into commentary Mercedes has meant, and then follow up on Andrew's most recent component around what is the society that surrounds a school. One is in countries such as South Africa, we're actually recording a 1-to-1 learning loss. So each day that a young person was not in school is equated to the learning loss that they will experience throughout their lifetime. In addition to that, we have countries like Uganda, which has been the longest country with school closures, amounting to almost 78 weeks over the past 2 years. And I think about that implication, and one report that was written by Brookings a few years ago that talked about it would take 100 years to get learners from developing countries to equate to the education levels of learners from developed countries. And so when we stack these on top of each other, I think it's incredibly frightening, the depth and impact of the pandemic, but also where a number of our countries are. And so when I think about how we need to really rethink the spaces of learning going forward, it is one certainly around understanding the importance of building a digital infrastructure, which is one, I think, a space where a lot of the entrepreneurs who are joining us today are really leveraging on, to ensure that regardless of where a young person is, whether they're in rural areas, where they're some of the most marginalized in conflict zones, that there is an opportunity for them to still have access to learning and continuity. And this speaks more to components around innovation. But I think there's also a really critical piece that talks about process. So how do we think about the actual process of learning, and where does it occur? Oftentimes, this has been very much predicated to the rooms of a classroom. But I think more and more, the parts that I was most gravitating to during the pandemic were innovations around communities and clusters coming together to support young people to continue learning. One of the examples here is in Kenya, an entity called Dignitas, which is one of our partners, essentially created teacher clusters who were then able to go into the community and still continue with teaching and training of young people, utilizing mobile, SMS, and really gathering small clusters of community to continue learning, understanding that there would be too many restrictions otherwise for how these young people would be able to engage with learning content. And more, I'm curious on what are the spaces that exist for us to look at complementary forms of learning in the informal sectors, learning through multiple pathways that exist outside of formal education systems, to ensure that regardless of where a young person is, how they engage with learning and development, that they still have access and opportunity. Because as you've said, young people do not enter into learning and earning in a linear fashion. And so it's important that they see success regardless of at what point they enter into this process.
Thank you very much, Teresa, and thanks for answering my question. But from the audience, guys, we are receiving so many interesting questions. So I think it will be good if we invest the rest of our time in 24 minutes together to go through some of these questions, because I think they are touching on some of your different points, and it will be really interesting to know what you think of. So Namande has been asking about the rural areas. The question is, of course, about the importance of quality education, and it helps to break the cycle of poverty, which reduces inequalities and promotes gender equality, but how can the people in the rural areas be involved to attain high quality education? Mercedes, would you like to go for this one?
Yes, absolutely. And this is very much connected to the issue of who should we target? What kind of students, what kind of learners we should target, right? And of course, people living in remote areas are one of those are a group of students that are in particular need of that. And so to reach those kind of students, and it's very interesting because we had this conversation for many years, but actually the pandemic put that at the core of our education strategies, because from one day to the next, all the students were sent home and they were all remote learners, right? So they were kind of the rural, they were all rural students living in remote, so particularly those that were lacking connectivity. So in the region, and I would like to hear Teresa from her experience in Africa and other countries, is in the region, countries really, the ministries of education really struggle to bring different alternatives from low tech to high tech to students. And some of them were just delivering literally textbooks door to door, so to make sure that the education continued, right? The education service continued. But some others were using radio, some others were using TV. So we've seen a lot, and this is great because of the audience that we have today. We've seen a lot of partnerships, private public partnerships with broadcasting companies, etc. Providing spaces to broadcast content, educational content to kids. We've seen a lot of agreements with telecom companies to remove the charges for data to users that when they were connecting to specific educational platforms put to the students provided by the ministries of education to students. So that's another way. Then there is a lot of potential. I mean, I'm talking about low tech solutions, but even in the high tech solutions, of course, one thing is clear: connectivity should today be a right. It's not an option anymore. It's not a luxury. It's not a nice to have as part of education. It's a must have. And together with connectivity, of course, come all of these learning platforms, etc., that we need to provide high quality content to our students through these platforms. And to a point that Teresa mentioned before, and also Undrew, teachers, we go into the classroom with our old ways of doing things, or our old ways of teaching, with our old pedagogies. If we are bringing in technology, we need also to upgrade how we relate to children and youth, and how we interact with them, and how we make the best use of these digital platforms, so that we can actually accelerate learning to the level that actually overcomes this 100 years difference between advanced economies and middle and lower income economies. That's the kind of things that we need to do. So then there are other options in the meantime, like satellite connections, connectivity, and so on. We know they are more expensive, but there are many things. And finally, and I'm gonna finish with this, even within the high tech solutions, there are unplugged versions. So to the entrepreneurs that are here today in the room, to be able to bring the most of the digital experience to children and youth that are disconnected, we can still provide unplugged solutions. We need to develop those high quality digital unplugged solutions, so that they can have the same experience as any other child in a developed country. So that would be.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. Thank you for your answer. And I have a question for Andrew from Xin Wong from Malaysia. She's asking about unemployment. So how do we try to solve unemployment rate, since all children can try and do have the equal opportunities and having the quality education? I mean, I think I will just put a comma here. The people that do have access to quality education and equal opportunities. However, how we can improve the unemployment rate, because most of Malaysians in this case, I believe, can't get a job even after they graduated. So they are not employable, even if they have a lot of skills.
No, it's a great question. I mean, of course, it's unemployment's a challenge for all age groups, not just for the coming generations coming out of school. But there's no question. One issue that colleagues spoke to earlier is that mismatch sometimes between what's being learnt in school and what employers need, and so then they struggle to find the right skills and talents and knowledge, and they have to perhaps invest more in order to get it. There's another issue which is actually about how fair recruitment is, and sometimes you see in countries there's sort of appointment of people who might be in amongst family or friends rather than a more objective process that would actually recognize the more talented and more qualified students coming out of schools, but who might not have those connections, or might be, as we were just hearing, in more rural and remote areas. So there's a big mismatch there. And then there are, of course, much wider structural factors. But I do think the key ultimately is about investment for innovation and growth, and then trying to create a level playing field and ensuring that this next generation is then able to tap into it with the most relevant skills, to the extent and the degrees at which employers can't go on refusing or ignoring them, but have to recognize their talents as part of the future of success and growth.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And I think this has been, for the audience, one of the key points that we have discussed as well in gender equality and climate action panels, when we were talking about the diversity and inclusion as one of the key, not just nice buzzwords, but actually something that companies do need to start thinking strategically, and as from a business perspective, of course. And Teresa, there is a question for you about a case in Kenya, which is trying to implement the competence-based curriculum. How would such a curriculum change the quality of the outcomes of the graduates? Do you have any about that?
Absolutely. And before I respond to that, and I hope you don't mind that I, as my panelists are also speaking, I find components that I want to add on to, which was the query that was addressed to, that was shared with Andrew, around employment and unemployment, particularly for young people in much of the world. And so unlike a number of countries where you have the formal sector contributing quite strongly to new hires, to job creation, a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa, have the informal sector as the greatest contributor to new jobs. In Kenya, it is something anywhere between 85% to 90% of new jobs come from the informal sector. More and more, the types of innovation that you'll see coming from social sectors and private sector is around enabling more and more young people to become micro-entrepreneurs. And I think there's always like the risk associated with young people entering into these fields, but understanding that the ability for them to have some form of livelihood, some form of income, allows them to not only support themselves, support their families, their communities, and that at the very least is a foundational element for them to grow on. We're seeing incredible innovations coming from South Africa, which if we have time, I'll speak to, and in Kenya, specifically directed around how do we provide young people with the most incredible amount of skills to enable them to succeed as young entrepreneurs, regardless of whether they're coming from high settlement areas, high density areas, coming from the informal sector. And so I think that's also an incredible opportunity to be tapped into. When I think about the CBC in Kenya and the competency-based curriculum, as a written principle and document, it's actually incredibly strong. It speaks to much of what we as a panel have spoken to. So how do we really foster the right mindsets in young people? How do we ensure that we're not simply building upon a rote learning system, but enabling for young people who can engage constructively, who can query and critique, and who are able to have the capacity and mindsets to become problem solvers. And so I think that component of the CBC is quite, I think, attractive to many of us who exist within the education space. As in many cases, the implementation of the competency-based curriculum is, I think, where we'll face hurdles. And we've seen this across multiple other countries in the African context which have tried to implement a similar reform within their education system. And I think here what is really important to understand is, one, how do we invest in teachers from the first instance? And in addition to, how do we partner more and more with private sector to bring in innovations that can either alleviate the costs or bring in more innovations within classroom systems to unburden the educators and teachers themselves. But I am certainly in support of reforms that allows us to really create young people who have the mindsets to succeed in this world.
Thank you very much, Teresa. And there is a question here about attracting capital, and I would like maybe all of the three of you maybe to answer, because Martin from Kenya is asking, how can we attract capital to solve resource requirements, especially around innovation when we're thinking about the internet devices and even basic electricity? Is there anything that we can do and we can think of, in this case, I think from a startupper perspective, in terms of attracting capital to these regions? Mercedes, do you want to go for this one?
That's a tricky question. So I think it's so attracting capital to education. It's very interesting because and probably my colleagues Andrew and Teresa can share more experiences about that, but everybody likes to talk about education. And one thing that we've seen, for example, in the region is that that particularly during the pandemic, together with health, education has been one of the topics that has been in the air, in the newspapers, and everybody's talking about it, and school closures and this kind of learning losses and dropouts and so on. However, to get a Minister of Finance to actually say, here's the money, it's it's particularly in a context of fiscal constraints. Latin American region, the impact of the crisis, I mean, is the toll of the crisis is 7.8 GDP percent of GDP lost as a consequence of the pandemic. We are talking about big numbers here. And so, of course, we are living in difficult moments for investments in education and for attracting capital. So that's one thing. But I think one of the I would say two things. The kind of a magic combination between effective solutions, innovative, effective solutions that have the potential to scale up relatively fast, so that they can show results in a relatively short term, and combined to these innovative financing solutions. So I think we are seeing a lot of impact bonds and these kind of new ways of attracting capital, that is because what you are funding is attached to a result. And so I think there is this combination between, the right solution with short-term results and effective, and these innovative ways of financing.
Yep, I think we lost the Mercedes. So do you want Andrew to add a bit on that, and Teresa?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, no, I'd agree with what Mercedes was saying. I mean, I think there are interesting new models of innovative finance. There is something of a tension because in many crunches there's an understandable concern about, for example, private school operators and the implications for equality of that. But even in those circumstances, there's a lot of potential for innovation around tools and approaches, including in technologies that are used. And at the same time, we're certainly seeing a kind of growing debate about the need for governments to be investing a lot more, including potentially through raising specialist bonds or other instruments in order to generate support that could then provide sources of funding for startups and others that are intervening, whether in the classroom or often, I think, there's a lot of scope for digital technology, if you like, at the platform level. So at the back end, supporting teachers and school administrators and systems rather than necessarily as a replacement for teachers or teaching or individual tools for students.
Teresa, I will leave this as well, because I've seen that you had something to add.
Absolutely. And so I think what we've spoken about has also been at funding at a national level, which is where oftentimes you will see the social impact bonds and development impact bonds coming in. I think there's also, and while I do find incredible critique to be had on when we think about the aid dependency in a lot of African nations, there is components of development funding that can be and should be directed to building basic infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, both with regards to electrification and also with provision of access to broadband and connectivity. In a lot of the regions, we also have specific funding from mobile network operators, which is meant to be directed to this specifically. So how do we ensure that funding that is emanating both from external development partners, but also within the mobile network operators that exist within each country, can actually be directed to providing the necessary infrastructure to enable basic connectivity and procurement of other resources that are required for learning to continue. From an entrepreneur standpoint, when we think about the startup ecosystem and culture, a lot of the spaces when we think about after-school markets, when we think about tutoring, when we think about mobile educations, these are multi-billion-dollar industries. In Africa specifically, the startup ecosystem is now estimated to be around $5 billion, or to have received $5 billion in funding in 2021, which is also projected to increase. While the components directed towards ed and education initiatives is much lower, around 3 to 5%, it's still indicative of a market that is growing, a market that is ready to have more and more investments coming in. And so one of the things I'll always urge is to really support entrepreneurs who are existing in this ecosystem, because they are truly building the foundations that will change our economies and our countries. When we think about every 3 in 4 young people born by the next 30 years will be coming from the African continent. So supporting young African entrepreneurs to really build the solutions and the infrastructure is going to be paramount. And I think we'll see more and more funding coming into this ecosystem, understanding the future demographic trends.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Thanks for your answer to this, because I think it can leverage as well on a question from a startupper that we have for the 3 of you, that is all about edutech and the potential edutech companies, maybe that are joining from North America and Europe. Is there a chance for them to get into developing countries and create a material positive change in the academic and educational system? I think this can be both applied for, honestly, companies that are both from the named market and the question market, but as well, like as Teresa, you were mentioning, as well from the market itself, where there is a need. So let's say the emerging markets. So maybe, are there any examples of edutech companies and startups that you would like to share with the audience that they should be aware of? I don't know if Mercedes, you want to start?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yes, I think there are many different examples of startups that are booming in the edutech. So I think it's important to have in mind, and along the lines of what Teresa was mentioning, is that the edtech industry is approximately, according to Holon IQ, approximately a 6 billion industry today, but it's supposed to be growing in the coming years to a 10 billion industry, and is underdeveloped for the needs of the sector right now compared to, for example, the health sector. So it's about a third of what it is in the health sector. So these are some important numbers. So there is a great opportunity within the edtech to grow and to actually bring about important and substantive change. I think along these lines, just to mention, there are a lot of gamification games for learning. So talking about opportunities, so gamification is one of these areas, not just for learning opportunities, but also for measuring, so for assessments of learning. So we know that we have, and particularly now during the pandemic, we are kind of struggling to measure learning losses, and for some skills are harder to measure than others. So being able to gamify brings not just the self-reported answers to a question, but brings behavior into the assessment. So I think there is an area there that has huge potential. I don't want to mention specific names of startups, but that's an important area. Another important area has to do with credentials. And Andrew spoke a lot about employment opportunities and bringing together the needs of the industry and the need and what the education system and the training systems produce. And I think, again, there is a lot of evidence that is starting to emerge about the impact of short cycle programs. We need, and this applies for Latin America, but I think this is generalized and could be applied to other continents. It's that we know that we have a huge skills gap between what the industry needs right now and what the education is producing, also because the market is changing so fast. And so if we think of training people with traditional ways, traditional university degrees, for example, 4 or 5 years education degrees, we will never bridge that gap. So what we see in the market is what we call the education unbundling. So basically, education is not a bundle of services anymore, but is becoming more and more unbundled. So that's basically the production system. It's decomposed. And so we get these short cycle programs with certificates. And I mean, I'm not gonna mention any specific names, but there is one of the large companies, leading companies in around the world that just launched a certificate, a digital certificate for 6 months. And they say that for the purpose of hiring and salaries, they will consider that 6-month certificate as the equivalent of a university degree, of a 4 to 5 years university degree. Imagine what that means in terms of a disruption in the world of education and training, and bringing students and youth up to the speed of what the market needs. And so I think there is huge potential in these areas. And I'm just mentioning a few. I mean, artificial intelligence, we are seeing amazing things about that. For example, algorithms to allocate students and teachers to the most, to centralize allocation of students and teachers to the areas that are most in need. So that generates a lot of efficiencies in terms of the use of resources. But we are using artificial intelligence algorithms also, for example, in early warning systems to detect students at risk of dropping out. And the list goes on and on. The potential and the opportunities for innovating and for transforming through EdTech are gigantic.
Thank you very much, Mercedes, and thanks for naming the algorithms points, because this has been one of the innovations that with the FT Talent team we have been working on. So basically how we recruit challengers and individuals to take part to these kind of events that of course give a certificate to people is based on a 200 data point persona that we can build not just out of a CV or a cover letter, but it's based on the interactions that people do have with our website and our platforms, and basically just to have also a well-rounded idea of a candidate in that case. So it's a bit of more like, a concept all around, even like, companies like us, how we can tap into diversity and inclusion in terms of like really actionable points and how technology can support us in that. So we literally have a few seconds left. Maybe Andrew and Teresa, you just want to share one piece of wisdom with our audience, maybe one example or like one suggestion for entrepreneurs that are watching you. Maybe Andrew, you want to go?
Yeah, I'd just say, going back to the earlier point, yes, there may be opportunities for example, tech startups, let's say in the US, to apply and extend into other lower income countries. But I would say you really have to work with the local communities and ideally be from those local communities, because there's so much danger, including with AI, otherwise, about all sorts of hidden biases and concerns that need to be thought through. And finally, technology is fundamental. It begins with the basics of infrastructure and access, but ultimately it's a tool, it's not a solution in its own right. So again, it still should be used very much in concert with teachers and with local communities if we're really going to achieve better educational outcomes.
Teresa, thank you, Andrew.
Absolutely, and absolutely agree with Andrew on building in context. I will also say that innovation also occurs in context. And so as we think about the work that you as entrepreneurs, as young founders, will be doing in spaces of education and learning and youth development to ensure that the solutions that are being built, that are being prepared are one, with understanding the true problem in mind, and two, that are actually applicable for the markets and the environments that you're working in. One example for me that I've deeply been attracted to is the Zlato platform in South Africa, which was built in the townships, looked at the socioeconomic issues that young people face, and has essentially created a platform that allows for micro-skilling, micro-learning, and micro-work on this platform, and also built on a blockchain platform that allows for young people to be incentivized for the work and the courses that they're taking to be able to redeem the earnings within actual stores, to buy airtime and data. And so really thinking about contextual issues and challenges, building a platform that allows for learning and work, and actually incentivizes young people. So as you think about what you're building, does it really address the problem? Is it built in context? And hopefully, if it answers those questions, then you'll be able to scale and impact more and more young people.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mercedes. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Teresa, for joining us today for this quality education panel and generally for the FTxSDG Challenge. So really, thank you so much. And thanks for your amazing contributions to this discussion. And thanks for all the comments and the questions that we received on our platform. So this was the last panel of the day. I want to thank all of the viewers and the audience that from a general public and challengers have been joining us today for our first day together. Tomorrow, do not forget to connect back at 11:30 a.m. London time for another great day of inspirational talks. We're going to cover the other 3 SDG topics that we have prepared for you, as well as other networking sessions between you guys, between the challengers, either startup founders and individual participants. It has been a real pleasure to be with you today and really to see such an amazing discussion going through digitally. But we hope that through the networking events, you could really have an exchange of thoughts and ideas in kind of, face-to-face, even if in a virtual ecosystem. I think what we are showing with this event, with the Financial Times and Seedstars, is that we do need to adapt to the digital ecosystem. And this is what we are doing. So we're bringing to life this event that thanks to technology, we can really cover different regions, different time zones, but especially diverse talents from all over the planet. So thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you from the Financial Times team and the FT Talent team. Thanks to our video and studio team that joined us today. And of course, thanks to our partner, Seedstars. We see you tomorrow, 11:30 a.m. London time. Don't miss it.